September 24, 1942, the day Germany fired its best general for being right. By mid-1942, Nazi Germany was deep in the Soviet Union. After the initial victories of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Hitler believed that the Red Army was close to collapse. He launched a new offensive in the summer of 1942, Case Blue, Fall Blau, aiming to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad, a major industrial and symbolic target. But the campaign was already showing signs of disaster. The German lines were dangerously stretched over hundreds of miles. Supply routes were collapsing, and Soviet resistance was stiffening. At this critical moment, General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, was one of the few senior officers willing to confront Hitler with the truth. The briefing, September 24, 1942. During a tense meeting at the Wolf's Lair, Halder presented a grim assessment. German forces were overextended. Soviet strength was underestimated. The logistics could not support both the Caucasus and Stalingrad offensives simultaneously. Without consolidating positions, disaster was inevitable. Hitler reacted with fury. He accused Halder of defeatism and disloyalty. Hitler believed that sheer willpower and faith in victory could overcome material weakness, a delusion that would soon doom entire armies. That same day, Hitler dismissed Halder as chief of the General Staff. His replacement was General Kurt Zeitzler, a more obedient officer who promised to follow Hitler's orders without question. Who was Franz Halder? Franz Halder was not a frontline general, but a brilliant planner and strategist. As chief of the General Staff since 1938, he helped shape the early Blitzkrieg campaigns that conquered Poland, France, and much of Europe. However, by 1942, Halder had grown increasingly frustrated with Hitler's interference and unrealistic military decisions. Halder's dismissal marked the end of the professional general staff tradition that had guided the German army for over a century. After he was fired, strategic planning became increasingly dictated by Hitler alone, with disastrous consequences. The aftermath. After Halder's removal, the Eastern Front entered a downward spiral. Hitler refused to allow retreats, even when encirclement was certain. At Stalingrad, over 250,000 Axis troops were surrounded and destroyed in early 1943. The Wehrmacht never recovered its strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Ironically, Halder's warnings in September 1942 were completely accurate. Everything he predicted came true within months. After the war, Halder was captured by the Allies and later testified at the Nuremberg trials. In the 1950s, he helped the U.S. Army document the German war experience for Cold War research. In 1961, he was awarded the U.S. Meritorious Civilian Service Award for his contributions, a rare honor for a former German general. The Frozen Front. How the Eastern Winter broke Hitler's army. Date: February, March 1943. Location: the Eastern Front, Soviet Union. Event: the German collapse after Stalingrad. After Stalingrad, a shattered army. When the guns finally fell silent at Stalingrad in February 1943, the German Reich was stunned. For the first time since the war began, the world saw Nazi Germany defeated and humiliated. More than 250,000 Axis troops had been lost, a full army group wiped out. The myth of Hitler's invincible Wehrmacht was shattered forever. But the disaster didn't end with the surrender. Across hundreds of miles of frozen steppe, the remnants of German forces were in chaotic retreat, pursued by a resurgent Red Army. The Winter of Revenge. The Soviet Union, filled with new confidence, launched a series of offensives along the entire front. From Leningrad to the Don River, German divisions were battered and exhausted. Temperatures plunged to 30 degrees C, 22 degrees here. Engines froze, weapons jammed, and frostbite claimed more soldiers than bullets. The Red Army's tanks and artillery, now mass-produced in staggering numbers, pushed forward relentlessly. Soviet soldiers shouted a single word as they advanced: Stalingrad. For them, this was vengeance, a payback for the death and destruction Germany had unleashed. Hitler's orders: no retreat. Even as the front disintegrated, Hitler refused to allow withdrawals. He issued new orders from his headquarters in East Prussia. Not one step back. Every position must be held at all costs. Generals begged to regroup or fall back to more defensible lines. But Hitler saw retreat as weakness. Entire divisions were surrounded and destroyed because they obeyed his impossible commands. The same mistake that doomed the Sixth Army at Stalingrad was now being repeated across the front. Manstein's counterstroke. Despite the chaos, one man managed to temporarily stabilize the front. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant commanders. In February 1943, Manstein launched a daring counteroffensive in southern Russia, known as the Third Battle of Kharkov. Using mobile reserves and tactical genius, he recaptured the city and inflicted heavy losses on the Soviets. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the Wehrmacht had regained its strength. Hitler celebrated, calling it proof that his willpower could still overcome reality. But Manstein knew the truth. His victory was temporary. The German army was bleeding out. Its manpower, fuel, and morale were nearly gone. The state of the Eastern Front. By spring 1943, both sides were exhausted. The front had stabilized, but the balance of power had changed forever. The Soviets now held the initiative. The Germans were on the defensive. The Wehrmacht's veteran corps, the men who had conquered Europe, was decimated. Hitler refused to accept that the tide had turned. Instead, he began planning one last massive offensive, an attempt to restore his prestige. The Battle of Kursk, Hitler's last gamble. Date, July 5th, August 23rd, 1943. Location, Kursk, Soviet Union. Event, the largest tank battle in history. Prelude, the dream of a comeback. After the winter disasters of 1942-43, Hitler needed a miracle. The loss of Stalingrad had shaken the German people and emboldened the Allies. Across the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht was exhausted and retreating. But in the summer of 1943, Hitler believed he saw a chance to strike back. Near the city of Kursk, a huge bulge, salient, had formed in the Soviet front lines, 250 kilometers wide and 160 kilometers deep. Hitler saw this as the perfect opportunity to encircle and destroy a large part of the Red Army, just as Germany had done in 1941. He called the plan Operation Citadel, Unternehmen Citadel, his decisive blow to regain the initiative in the east. Planning the offensive. Hitler gathered his best commanders. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, south. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, north. He also placed high hopes on new weapons, the Panther and Tiger tanks, and the Ferdinand tank destroyers, machines he believed would crush the Soviet defenses. But there was a problem. The Soviets already knew what was coming. Thanks to intelligence reports and reconnaissance, Joseph Stalin and his generals, especially Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, were fully aware of Germany's plans months in advance. Instead of attacking first, they prepared the most heavily fortified defensive line in history. Over 3,000 miles of trenches, 400,000 mines, 5,000 anti-tank guns, 1.3 million Soviet soldiers waiting for the German assault. It was a trap, and Hitler was walking straight into it. The battle begins. At dawn on July 5, 1943, the German offensive began with a thunderous bombardment. From both north and south, German panzers rolled forward into a storm of fire. In the north, General Walter Model's 9th Army ran into dense minefields and anti-tank zones. Progress was painfully slow. In the south, Manstein's forces under General Hermann Hoth made better progress. Led by elite SS Panzer divisions such as Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, the fighting was ferocious. Villages changed hands multiple times. Tanks burned by the hundreds. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand among wreckage and smoke. Prokhorovka, the Clash of Titans. On July 12, 1943, near the village of Prokhorovka, the battle reached its climax. Over 1,200 tanks, German Tigers and Panthers, against Soviet T-34s, clashed in one of the largest armored battles in human history. The plain was filled with fire, dust, and chaos. Soviet tanks charged at close range to nullify the Germans' superior firepower. Many were destroyed, but their sheer numbers overwhelmed the attackers. By the end of the day, the fields around Prokhorovka were littered with burning metal and bodies. The German advance had stalled. The fall of Italy, when Hitler lost his ally. Date, July, September 1943. Location, Italy and the Mediterranean. Event, the collapse of Mussolini's fascist regime. Prelude, the shock after Kursk. By the summer of 1943, Nazi Germany was on the defensive everywhere. In the east, the Battle of Kursk had just ended in disaster. In the west, Allied bombers were striking German cities day and night. Then came another blow, this time from the south. On July 9, 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, marking the beginning of the campaign to liberate Europe from the south. It was a masterstroke designed to knock Italy out of the war, and it worked far faster than anyone expected. The invasion of Sicily. Under the joint command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allied invasion force consisted of over 160,000 troops, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft. The British Eighth Army, led by Bernard Montgomery, landed in the southeast. The American Seventh Army, under General George S. Patton, landed in the west. The Italian defenses crumbled almost immediately. Many soldiers surrendered without firing a shot. Even the German units stationed on the island quickly realized they could not hold it. By August 17, 1943, the Allies had captured all of Sicily. It was a stunning success, but the real shock came from within Italy itself. Mussolini falls. For over 20 years, Benito Mussolini had ruled Italy as Il Duce, the leader. But by 1943, his regime was collapsing under military defeats, economic ruin, and growing public anger. The loss of Sicily was the final humiliation. On July 24th, the fascist Grand Council, the very institution that had once worshipped him, voted to remove him from power. The next day, Mussolini was arrested on the orders of King Victor Emmanuel III, who told him bluntly, "My dear Deuce, it's no longer any good. Italy needs a change." For the first time in 2 decades, Mussolini was no longer the ruler of Italy. Italy changes sides. The new Italian government, led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, publicly claimed it would continue the war alongside Germany, but secretly, it began negotiating with the Allies. On September 3, 1943, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. When the announcement was made 5 days later, the entire country erupted in chaos. Italian troops in the field didn't know what to do. Some surrendered to the Allies, others were disarmed or massacred by their former German allies. Hitler was furious. He saw Italy's betrayal as a personal insult and immediately ordered Operation Axa, the German takeover of Italy. The German response, Operation Axa. In a lightning move, German troops occupied northern and central Italy within days. They disarmed Italian units, executed officers who resisted, and took control of all major cities, including Rome. The road to Stalingrad, when Hitler ignored reality. October 1942, February 1943. Location: Stalingrad, Soviet Union. Event: the turning point of World War II. After dismissing General Franz Halder in September 1942, Adolf Hitler took full personal control of the war on the Eastern Front. His new chief of staff, General Kurt Seitzler, was competent but far more compliant. Exactly what Hitler wanted. With Halder gone, there were no more voices of reason in the German high command. Every major decision, strategy, movement, reinforcements, now passed through Hitler himself. He believed that willpower alone could triumph over logistics, manpower, or weather. The stage was set for one of the greatest military catastrophes in history. Operation Blue and the Division of Forces. The German 1942 summer offensive, Operation Blue, was initially designed to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. However, Hitler's obsession with the city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad, caused him to split his forces. He divided Army Group South into 2 parts. Army Group A, sent toward the Caucasus oil fields. Army Group B, ordered to capture Stalingrad. This fatal division meant that neither force had sufficient strength to achieve its objectives. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was tasked with taking Stalingrad, a city that would soon become a graveyard. The battle begins. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe began a devastating bombing campaign that reduced much of Stalingrad to rubble. But instead of breaking Soviet resistance, it created a perfect defensive fortress. Every factory, basement, and ruined building became a strongpoint. The Soviet 62nd Army, led by General Vasily Chuikov, fought for every street, sometimes every floor of a single building. The Germans referred to the brutal combat as Rattenkrieg, Ratwa. Progress was measured in meters, not miles. Hitler's obsession. By October 1942, the Sixth Army was exhausted. Ammunition was low, casualties were staggering, and winter was approaching. General Paulus and several commanders pleaded for permission to withdraw or regroup. Hitler's response was absolute. No step back. Stalingrad will be taken. No retreat. He promised reinforcements and supplies that never came. When his staff warned that the Soviets were massing for a counterattack, he dismissed the reports, just as he had dismissed Halder's warnings weeks earlier. Operation Uranus, the trap closes. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment that struck the weak Romanian and Hungarian flanks guarding Paulus's rear. Within days, the entire German Sixth Army was surrounded. Over 250,000 men trapped inside Stalingrad. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold his ground and promised that the Luftwaffe would resupply the army by air. It was a deadly illusion. The planes could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. Hunger, frostbite, and Soviet A. The Eastern counterattack. The Red Army strikes back. Date: late 1943, spring 1944. Location: Ukraine, Belarus, Eastern Front. Event: the Soviet counteroffensive that broke the Wehrmacht. Prelude: from defense to dominance. After the failed German offensive at Kursk in July 1943, the balance of power on the Eastern Front changed forever. The Red Army, once battered and desperate, was now a modern war machine, rebuilt, reorganized, and ready to strike. Its soldiers were battle-hardened, its commanders experienced, and its factories, relocated east of the Ural Mountains, were producing tanks, guns, and aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. For the first time since 1941, the Soviet Union seized the strategic initiative. Now, it was their turn to attack. Operation Rumyantsev and the liberation of Kharkov. In August 1943, just weeks after Kursk, the Red Army launched Operation Rumyantsev, a massive assault on the city of Kharkov, one of the most fought-over cities of the war. Despite fierce German resistance, including elite SS Panzer divisions, Soviet forces finally captured Kharkov on August 23, 1943. It was the fourth and final battle for the city, and a decisive Soviet victory. The liberation of Kharkov marked the end of Germany's offensive power in the east. From this point on, the Wehrmacht could only retreat. The battle for the Dnieper. Next came one of the largest operations in military history. The Battle of the Dnieper. August-December 1943. Over 4 million men fought along a front stretching more than 2,400 kilometers. The Dnieper River was a formidable natural barrier, but Soviet troops built pontoon bridges under heavy fire, crossed in small boats, and established dozens of bridgeheads. By November 1943, the Soviets had recaptured Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. Church bells rang across Moscow in celebration, a sound not heard since before the war began. Hitler's delusion holding the line. Even as the Red Army surged westward, Hitler refused to accept reality. He ordered his generals to stand fast at all costs, forbidding any tactical withdrawals. Entire divisions were trapped and annihilated when they could have escaped. German commanders, terrified of defying orders, sacrificed tens of thousands of men just to hold meaningless ground. The once mighty Wehrmacht was bleeding out, fighting for survival, not victory. Winter, 1943-44, the Soviet steamroller. Through the harsh winter, the Red Army kept pressing forward. New offensives erupted along the entire front. In Belarus, the Baltic states, and southern Ukraine, Soviet soldiers pushed into territories Germany had held for nearly 2 years. Villages and cities lay in ruins, but the red flag rose again over each one. For the German soldier, the Eastern Front had become a nightmare without end. Endless retreats through mud and snow. Operation Bagration, the destruction of Army Group Center. Date: June 22, August 19, 1944. Location: Belarus, then part of the Soviet Union. Event: the Soviet offensive that shattered Hitler's Eastern Front. Prelude: the calm before the storm. By the summer of 1944, the tide of war had completely turned. The Western Allies had just landed in Normandy, D-Day, June 6th. The Soviet Union, fresh off victories in Ukraine, was preparing a massive strike of its own. Hitler still believed that the main Soviet attack would come from the south, toward Romania and the oil fields of Ploiești. He was wrong. The Soviets were about to unleash their greatest offensive of the war, right through the center of the German line. The plan, Operation Bagration. Named after a hero of the Napoleonic Wars, Operation Bagration was designed to destroy Army Group Center, Germany's strongest and most important formation on the Eastern Front. The Red Army's plan was brilliant in both scale and deception. Under Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky and Marshal Georgy Zhukov, 4 massive Soviet fronts, army groups, over 2.3 million men would attack, simultaneously from multiple directions. 1.7 million troops, 4,000 tanks, 24,000 artillery pieces, 5,300 aircraft. The Germans had only about 800,000 men to defend a 600-mile front. June 22, 1944, 3 years after Barbarossa. Exactly 3 years to the day after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Red Army struck back. At dawn on June 22nd, thousands of Soviet guns and rocket launchers opened fire. A thunderous artillery barrage smashed German lines across Belarus. Villages disappeared under smoke and fire. Then, Soviet armor and infantry surged forward, breaking through the front in multiple places. The German Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Ernst Busch, was completely unprepared. Communication lines collapsed, reserves were misplaced, and entire divisions were overwhelmed in days. Encirclement and annihilation. By the end of June, Soviet spearheads had surrounded entire German corps in a series of devastating pockets. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped and destroyed. In Vitebsk alone, 20,000 men were killed or captured within days. At Bobruisk, the destruction was so complete that Soviet soldiers described the roads as rivers of corpses and wrecked tanks. The Red Army advanced faster than any army had ever moved on the Eastern Front, sometimes 20-30 kilometers per day. The fall of Minsk. By early July, Soviet forces had completely broken through. Their next target, Minsk, the capital of Belarus and a key German supply hub. On July 3, 1944, Soviet tanks entered the city. Within a week, over 100,000 German troops were surrounded east of Minsk. Only a few thousand managed to escape. The rest were captured or killed. In just 2 weeks, the once powerful Army Group Center had ceased to exist. The Warsaw Uprising, Poland's tragic rebellion. Date: August 1st, October 2nd, 1944. Location: Warsaw, Poland. Event: Polish resistance fighters rise against Nazi occupation, expecting Soviet support that never fully arrives. Prelude: Hope and desperation. By summer 1944, the Red Army had smashed through Belarus during Operation Bagration, advancing toward Poland. For the Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa, this was the signal they had been waiting for. They believed that the Soviets' advance meant liberation was near, but also feared that if they didn't act quickly, Poland would fall under Soviet control instead of regaining independence. On August 1, 1944, at 5 p.m., a citywide alarm sounded in Warsaw. The uprising had begun. The fighters and their struggle. Around 40,000 poorly armed Polish resistance fighters faced over 50,000 German troops, heavily fortified in key positions. The Home Army relied on pistols, homemade explosives, and smuggled rifles. Their goal: seize control of Warsaw, declare Polish sovereignty, and hold the city until Soviet forces arrived. Initial successes were promising. Polish fighters liberated large parts of the city, including central districts. The Germans were caught off guard, and morale soared among Warsaw's population. The Soviet advance, a grim waiting game. From the east, Soviet forces had reached the Vistula River, just across from Warsaw. The Polish insurgents expected immediate support, but Stalin's Red Army halted on the riverbank. Supplies, reinforcements, and even attempts at coordination were minimal. Some historians argue that Stalin deliberately delayed assistance, hoping to weaken the non-communist Polish resistance before installing a pro-Soviet government. The result: the uprising was left to fight almost entirely on its own. Brutal German reprisals. The Germans responded with ruthless efficiency. Entire neighborhoods were bombed or burned. Civilians were executed indiscriminately. SS and Wehrmacht units engaged in house-to-house combat, turning Warsaw into a battlefield of rubble and death. By September, the situation for the insurgents was desperate. They were running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The fall of Warsaw. After 63 days of fighting, on October 2, 1944, the Home Army surrendered. Approximately 16,000 Polish fighters were killed. Civilian casualties numbered 150,000, 200,000. Many burned alive or massacred in the streets. Warsaw itself was systematically destroyed. Over 85% of the city's buildings were leveled by the retreating German forces. The Soviet army, stationed across the Vistula, watched largely passively as the city was annihilated. The Vistula-Oder Offensive. The Soviets enter Germany. Date: January 12th, February 3rd, 1945. Location: Poland and Eastern Germany. Event: the Red Army launches a massive winter offensive, sweeping across Poland and heading for the heart of Germany. Prelude: winter and momentum. By late 1944, the Red Army had reached the Vistula River, east of Warsaw, having crushed German forces in Belarus and northern Poland. Despite the brutal winter and stretched supply lines, Soviet High Command, under Marshals Zhukov and Konev, prepared the largest winter offensive of the war. The goal: break through German defenses in Poland, liberate the country completely, and advance into eastern Germany. Hitler, still clinging to hope, had ordered German forces to defend the territory at all costs, but the Wehrmacht was exhausted, understrength, and demoralized. The offensive begins. On January 12, 1945, the Soviets struck with overwhelming force. 2.5 million troops, 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 41,000 artillery pieces, 7,500 aircraft. The German Army Group A, tasked with defending southern Poland, was outnumbered nearly 3-1. Soviet artillery and air support pulverized. German lines before massive armored spearheads advanced. By January 17th, Soviet troops had crossed the Vistula and captured key cities, including Krakow, Łódź, and Warsaw's outskirts that had been devastated the previous year. Rapid advance into Germany. The speed of the Red Army's advance stunned German command. They retreated under pressure, leaving behind equipment and fortifications. By late January, Soviet forces had crossed the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. Cities like Frankfurt, Oder, and Stettin fell in rapid succession. Soviet mechanized units sometimes advanced 40 to 50 kilometers per day, one of the fastest sustained advances of the war. German collapse in desperation. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat. German divisions were decimated, disorganized, and often forced to fight piecemeal. Morale was collapsing. Hitler's promises of a miraculous counteroffensive rang hollow. Civilian evacuations became chaotic, with millions fleeing westward from the advancing Red Army. In Silesia and Pomerania, fierce pockets of resistance formed, but the Soviets systematically cleared them, often with heavy casualties on both sides. Scale of the offensive. The Vistula-Oder offensive was one of the largest and most decisive campaigns of the war. Side troops involved killed and missing captured, tanks lost. Soviet Union 2.5 million, 150,000 to 2,200. Germany 800,000, 200,000, 100,000, 1,500. The offensive left eastern Germany virtually defenseless and paved the way for the final assault on Berlin. The Battle of Berlin, the fall of the Third Reich. Date, April 16th, May 2, 1945. Location, Berlin, Germany. Event, the final Soviet assault on Nazi Germany, culminating in Hitler's death and the collapse of the Third Reich. Prelude, the capital besieged. By April 1945, the Red Army had reached the banks of the Oder and Neisse rivers, less than 80 kilometers from Berlin. Berlin, the symbolic and administrative heart of Nazi Germany, was defended by a mix of Wehrmacht veterans, Hitler Youth, and hastily conscripted civilians. Barely 900,000 men in total. Hitler, isolated in the Führerbunker, refused surrender. He believed that Berlin must be held at all costs, even as defeat became inevitable. The Soviet assault begins. On April 16, 1945, Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front launched a massive coordinated attack. 2.5 million Soviet troops, 6,250 tanks and assault guns, 41,000 artillery pieces, 7,500 aircraft. The German defenders were quickly overwhelmed by sheer firepower. Soviet artillery and airstrikes reduced entire city blocks to rubble before infantry and armored units moved in. Urban warfare and destruction. The battle for Berlin became house-to-house combat. Streets were barricaded. Buildings became fortified strongholds. Tanks were destroyed by anti-tank weapons in close quarters. The city became a maze of ruins, with firefights raging from basement to rooftop. Soviet troops advanced steadily despite heavy losses. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, and tens of thousands perished in the chaos. Hitler's final days. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler realized the war was lost. On April 30, 1945, he committed suicide, along with his wife, Eva Braun. His death symbolized the definitive collapse of Nazi command. German resistance in the city continued, sporadically but lacked coordination and morale. The fall of Berlin. On May 2, 1945, Berlin officially surrendered to Soviet forces. Approximately 92,000 German troops were captured. Civilian casualties numbered 100,000, 125,000, with much of the city destroyed. Soviet losses were around 80,000 killed and 200,000 wounded, reflecting the brutality of urban warfare. Berlin, the once mighty capital, lay in ruins,